Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. The Last Dinosaur is where we discuss the latest in the digitization within the maritime space. Today's guest is Harriet Hunnisett Johnson, Head of Maritime at Signol. Signol uses behavioral science to motivate employees to make more sustainable operational decisions. They do that by engaging with crews to save more fuel by combining existing data and processes with cutting-edge behavioral change techniques delivered via web app and communication services. Harriet, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me.
This has been a one that I've been really looking forward to having. Harriet and I met back earlier in the spring at the CMA, and I said to myself, I remember seeing her there going, oh, yes, I need to get Signol on the podcast because this is a really cool platform. Talk a little bit about kind of where you are today with Signol and a little bit about your own background.
Absolutely. So Signol itself started in the aviation industry, working with pilots of aeroplanes, nudging and using behavioral change techniques to encourage pilots of aeroplanes to use more efficient behaviors. The types of behaviors that you would do every single time when you were in a simulator with a instructor looking over your shoulder. Things like a single engine taxi down a runway. You don't need two engines to take you down runways. Well, some you do, some you don't. But so this kind of thing that, yes, you would do all the time in a simulator, but when you're out there in the real world, you have other priorities, you have other things, and these things sometimes get dropped down the list of priorities and don't always get done. So, we started in the airline industry, and then COVID hit. And obviously the planes were all saving an awful lot of fuel by not going anywhere. And that's when Signol sort of came to me and said, look, do you think this would work on ships? The Schulte brothers, so from Bernard Schulte, a ship management company, actually saw us present at an aviation conference and said, we think this could work on a vessel. It's the same principles. And so then we started the process of trying to adapt what we did onto a vessel. Obviously, a vessel is very different to the cockpit of an aeroplane. On an aeroplane, the pilot, you want to turn off an engine, you get the checklist out, you do the checks on the checklist, you turn off the engine. On a vessel, it's very different. You've got the person on the bridge who then picks up the phone down to the engine room, and the person who picks up the phone in the engine room is not the person who then goes physically down to the engine itself and starts the processes. There's a lot more between deciding that you need to do an action and actually taking it on a vessel. So we had to do all sorts of things to try and adapt what we did. But actually, we saw that it had a huge effect in the maritime industry on a vessel. The idea that actually you're going to treat the people on a vessel as human beings. They're not computers.
They're not a checklist item, right? They're not a checklist item. And it's so easy just to have that. Yeah, I appreciate that because, although I was a mariner a long time ago, I mean, you're talking about shutting down a diesel engine. I worked on a steamship, which has, I don't even think you probably don't have processes for that right now. Very few people do, but I worked on a steamship, which is, slowing the boiler down, getting the temperature, all these things. It's vastly different than, like you said, like the flight engineer or the captain just going through a checklist on his clipboard.
Exactly. No, it really is. But I think what we did find that there was a much bigger variation on what people did on a vessel than there is on an aeroplane, because on a plane they have these very strict standard operating procedures. The training is there's two types. There's two people manufacturing aeroplanes out there. You don't get much variation in the way that big commercial planes are flown. Whereas let's look at when you look at the maritime industry, there's no two vessels the same, not even sister ships are the same.
Not even sister ships. No. It is. And you talk about you have two airplane manufacturers, general commercial aviation, and maybe a handful of engine manufacturers, maybe. Interesting. I was just in East Hartford at a softball tournament, and I had coffee across the street, from one of those manufacturers, from Pratt and Whitney, right? So, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's an aviation person. He's like, yeah, Pratt and Whitney's one, GE's another, and Rolls Royce, and okay, so you got three and maybe you have a handful of variations and that's it. So what you're talking about, yeah, is the variety, which is massive.
Exactly, exactly. And so then you see the variety in human behavior as well around that, because there's different procedures and there's also different personalities on those vessels. People like to do things differently. So I was a deck officer myself, and we all knew those engineers, the ones who had their own, brought their own spanner with them, and had their own idea about the way an engine would sound to them and what they thought needed to be done with their engines. Not everyone, but some were like that, and some weren't, because people are different. And I think that's the key to what we do at Signol, is we understand that there are people on board vessels. People need to be communicated with in a certain way, and they need motivation to act in a certain way sometimes. And we all see that. That's the whole reason people have Fitbits. If you want to train to go and run a marathon, not everyone does that in the same way. And so we get the data, we understand how we work. And then we train ourselves up, and that's what we try and do at Signol. So I was a deck officer, like you. I worked on board, and I think I first saw that there was this issue between sort of technology and then people on board. When you're sat there on the bridge for hours and hours, and you start thinking about things, you start thinking about all the stuff that you're using. And you think, actually, the person who built this clearly didn't have any idea about what I do on a daily basis sat on the bridge of this ship. And that becomes more and more clear as you become more confident in what you do on the bridge of a ship. I think the most obvious example of this was one of the first cruise ships that I was on. We had a panel for the stabilizer fins. And it gets to a certain time in the evening on a cruise ship where that the galley has shut down, so there's no great big pans of water sloshing around, and dinner service is finished, so there's no waiters carrying loads of trays. The show is finished, so the dancers aren't worrying about slipping over on stage. And you think, well, maybe we could take the stabilizer fins in, because that's going to reduce the drag. Everyone's in bed, and so you look and you see how the stabilizer fins are working. Are they working hard? Well, you wouldn't do it then, but actually they're hardly doing anything. Let's try taking them in. But this particular panel didn't have a dimmer switch, which doesn't seem like a big thing to the normal person, but anyone who's been on the bridge of a ship knows that for half of your time driving that vessel, you are sitting in pitch black, because you've got to be able to see out the window. You've got to be able to see the lights on the other vessels to be able to maneuver effectively. You've got to be able to see voyage. And to turn on a screen that is going to take away your night vision is something that you're not going to do. You're not going to want to do. And so on that ship, those stabilizer fins just stayed out all night most of the time, because you just don't want to do that. And it's a small thing. It's a tiny thing. And it just, to me, highlighted the fact that the person who put that there or built that just didn't know.
Interesting. Well, firstly, that you even thought about that, because when I was on watch, what I was thinking about was doing, what am I going to do when I'm done? Where can I go vacation? What are my friends doing? Why am I stuck on an oil tanker and not on a cruise ship? So those were the things that I was thinking of. The ship that I was on at the time was I sailed in the mid 90s. It was a 1962 built single hull oil tanker for Mobil Oil. Single hull, everything was manual, everything. So you talk about engineers. I dealt not so much with the engineers, and I sailed a year as an AB because I got what they called shoved down the hawse pipe. So there were no jobs when I got out. So I took a job as an AB, so I really learned how to pump out a ship. The parlance is strip a ship. So, if anybody's listening, it's nothing funny. But to strip out the tanks in the ship, to load a ship, to top off, to do all that. And you do that all by hand. No sensors. The sensors was a dip thing that you had, and that was electronic. But it was a very different thing, and it never really crossed my mind to think about like the electronics and stuff like that. It did come in a little bit when Mobil Oil purchased the first American flag double hull tanker from Elliston, and there was a lot of concern about the design. The rudder was too small, the propeller was too small, and apparently the ship really just didn't turn very well. We had standing orders at night, if we're making a course correction, not to go above 5 degrees rudder. Otherwise, the ship would shake and you wait. And you would do the opposite. You would wake everybody up. So it's really interesting. I think that was maybe the time when we thought about design. I didn't spend a ton of time on that ship, so I don't necessarily remember. But pulling it back a little bit. So what you're doing is kind of taking the processes and kind of the processes that people do on ships, and it could be a lot of different things, and trying to get some more efficiencies. When you go into a company, you start to pitch this idea. It sounded like, one company was interested in, and you work with them, and that was Bernard Schulte. And I know that they're very proactive in that space. What are some of the reactions that you get? Talk a little bit about kind of how you have to deal with some of this change.
It's really interesting because I was prepared when I first was working for Signol and going out to companies for a lot of pushback. The idea that this is based around sociology, it's a soft science. It's not something that we can measure. It's not something real. Give me a box to put in a ship for efficiency. That type of attitude was what I expected.
Right.
But I found it was almost the exact opposite. And I also find that most of the time, especially when you're speaking to someone who has actually been a captain on board a vessel, they get it. Because I actually think that every captain on a vessel is an expert in behavioral science. You don't get to be a captain on a vessel without understanding human motivation. You know your crew. You know what motivates people. You understand the importance of people, of the human being. Ultimately, the only reason you can sleep at night is because you have trust that the person on the bridge of the ship will pick up that phone and call you if there is a big problem.
Yeah, so, which is something funny. Even though I was junior third mate, they had a third mate on board. I mean, God, gee, I think about like how long ago that was. I don't even, and I'm not saying anything bad. He was like in his late 50s, early 60s, 30 years ago. So I don't know if he's even alive, which is really weird to think about. But yeah, like they put me as a junior third mate, and again, I sailed on the ship as an AB, so I kind of had an established reputation as at least somebody that's going to do the right thing. They put me on the midnight to 4 shift, which is usually kind of a little bit more of a senior third mate. They're like, no, they know, because they knew that if something went a little weird, I would call. And it's interesting. I do have a comment about that captain thing. This is, I think, one of the first time I've ever said this to somebody. I don't necessarily agree with you, because I sailed with one particular captain who was not very good at that, who people did not like working for him. As a matter of fact, people did not like working for him. He was ex-military, and it didn't work. And the only reason, I think he hung around and he got promoted and he looked really good on a piece of paper, but he was not good. People didn't like working for him. Crew, you talk about like effective leadership. The other captain would come on, things would lighten up, work would get done. This one captain, I would never work for him, like ever. And he too is probably either long gone or almost gone. But I kind of disagree on that. I think, yes, good captains and people who want to work for it. And I think that's a parallel in industry as well. People get promoted sometimes, especially in trading environments. They get promoted to managing directors. They're good traders, good managing directors. They're terrible people, with people. And that's a whole different topic. That's just my belief. But yeah, so you do get, but I agree. You have to know how people react.
You do. And of course, you are always going to get the ones who refuse to treat human beings as human beings. But yeah, as I say, I see mostly people who do understand this. The example I give is normally of an engineer with auxiliary engines. If you have an engineer down in an engine room who has, let's say, 3 auxiliary engines online, and the load for the vessel drops to a point where you can now take one of those auxiliary engines offline. But it's also 10 a.m. smoko time. So what is that engineer going to do? Are they going to start the process to take off that engine straight away? Or are they going to go and grab a cup of coffee whilst it's still hot in the mess with the rest of the crew first? It's only 10, 15 minutes. We all know as human beings that there's never one way that will always happen. But we do know that there's always that temptation, that motivation to, you know what, I just need a cup of coffee first. And this isn't around training. You know, this person knows how to do this action. This isn't around not having enough data. You know, we always think we don't have enough data from the vessels, but this person can quite clearly see from the data what needs to be done. This is about human motivations. This small bit here is human motivation. Is that human in that moment motivated enough to stay and do that? Or should they go and grab that cup of coffee? And what we've seen is actually there's just a huge variation in what people do. The reality is that some people will do one thing all the time, but most people will sometimes do one and sometimes do the other. Because as human beings, different things motivate us. And so that's where Signol sits. It's in that space. We try and give that person in that moment the motivation so that the priority is, actually, I'm going to be efficient in this moment. And I know I'm going to get rewarded for being efficient in this moment. And I know that it's important to be efficient in this moment. And that's where Signol sits. That's what we do. We deal with that. And you do find the minute you start to explain this is to anyone, they get it because we're all human beings. We've all been in similar situations. And that actually nudging and setting targets in the way that we do is much better than directly telling people. Especially we find crew members, we find captains of aeroplanes and of vessels tend to react quite badly when being told directly what to do, because ultimately they're in charge of their vessel. If something goes wrong, they end up in prison.
Yeah, I guess that's something, a struggle that kind of came out of, OPA 90 and other legislations where certainly, how much does the office interfere, right? That's always been a struggle with any sort of legislation or even, ISO, ISM, all those other things. At what line are you talking about? You recommending to the captain, telling the captain, you're telling the captain what to do? Weather routing, I know, was at one point a really big thing. Well, the weather route says to go this way, but I'm looking out the window and I don't agree with that because I see if I go that way, it's going to be this, but I know we can do the other thing. So I think that's a really interesting thing. In terms of motivation, what kind of motivation do companies give or do to kind of get the desired result, especially around efficiency? Because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about making the vessel more efficient, which ultimately leads to better ratings, right? Because this is more of an operational efficiency, so that would affect your CII. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yes, it really does, and I do like it. It's a starting point, and you've got to start somewhere. I think it has done a bit of damage with crew because the first thing the crew sees is the inconsistencies. A crew member looks down and says, "What? So you mean I can steam around with no cargo on board and it's going to be a positive thing for efficiency?" The crew are very good at finding holes in things normally because they're the ones who practically have to carry these things out. So I think potentially it's created a bit of negative publicity, I guess, around what comes out of legislation, because the crew, it's just another one of those things where the crew say, "Oh, do they just not understand what we do on board then?" But the fact is, we as an industry do get that. We do understand that it's not perfect, and I think that's what you're saying, is that it's not the best. It's not perfect, but also it's somewhere to start. And absolutely, and if it starts that conversation around crew behavior and operational efficiency, that's great, because we need to. There are huge holes in operational efficiency at the moment. Some of our trials showed between 5 to 12% reduction in fuel, which for me is it's crazy amounts.
That's massive. That's massive, because if you look at like at one of the really interesting things that I saw, it was right before COVID, or right during, maybe during COVID, when I was scrolling through YouTube, and they had a video on there for one of the first experiments using hard sails. And I think it was with a company tramping in the Baltic. And they said they had like 5 or 6% efficiency. So if you can marry your 5 or 6% less fuel, not necessarily efficient, but less fuel, and then throw on what you're talking about, you're hitting double digits, right? I mean, right off, like with what you're talking about, and that's what I always think is it has to be a combination, but those are massive numbers.
They are. And I think in a scenario like the one you just described, I don't think it would be on top of. I think that those would actually work alongside each other. That I'm pretty sure some of that percentage gain from wind sales is that actually you put something like that in a ship and the crew suddenly get more engaged in being more efficient because it is higher up in their mind. So you can't always pull these things apart in that way.
That's interesting.
And I think it must be so hard for any ship owner who's being told by so many different providers, I'm going to save you 5%, I'm going to save you 10%, I'm going to save you 2%. You get dangerously close to saving more fuel than you have on board.
Well, yeah, wait a minute. Well, and that brings it to a point because I had on Scott Bergeron from Ollendorf, and he said if somebody comes up to me, he runs like the technical group. He says somebody comes to me and says, I could save you, and he over 10%. I throw them out the door. He said because I don't think double digits is there yet.
Exactly, and I mean a big part of our job is trying to measure the human element and the effect that we are having. And we started using econometrics, which has come from the behavioral science community. And I just gave a talk actually at the 5th Decarbonizing conference on how we're starting to do this, because that's exactly it. It's about measuring these things in a way that is believable and can be attributed as a whole. You need to look at the ship as a whole, and you need to look at the savings as a whole, and you need to then, when you find out a figure for the whole vessel, you can then start attributing it to these different things. You almost need to do a holistic view of a vessel as opposed to just targeting one trial and saying, like, this trial's done this and this has done this. It's more complex than that. We have a whole data science team who does that, and I think that's probably a whole other podcast, to be honest with you.
Well, yeah, and I think it's interesting because I go back to an earlier statement that you made, which I find fascinating. It's not a data issue. We could get the data. And I think it becomes a data science and interpretation issue. Well, what does it all mean? Like, you could look at 100 different things, 100 different ways and come up with different conclusions. And I think, and maybe you have an incomplete data set in one place, which is going to skew an answer, and you only have it incomplete because you're not really ever looked at it before. I mean, I think there could be so many different ways that you have to look at to assure that you do get it, because I do think what's going to happen is the ships will start becoming more efficient, reducing their carbon footprint, increasing the savings that owners could pass on to charterers, if not, in whatever way they choose, including with the form of carbon credits, which is, which has monetary, implications.
Really does. It does. But I think for me, the key is there's no doubt in my mind or in anyone's mind at Signol, or in fact, in many people's minds of everyone I speak to in the industry, that a positively engaged and motivated crew will make more efficient decisions. I think that's the heart of it. How you measure that, how you implement that, how you get that motivation, that's all around the edge. But for me, that core sentence, I haven't met many people who will go against that. And if you have sailed on board, you will have seen that. I always remember we had a weather station on board for the Met Office that sent weather data directly to the Met Office. It was up on the Monkey Island. We were in Southampton one day and they came on board and they said, we haven't been getting anything from your weather station for a while now. And we said, okay, you can go and have a look if you like it. Up there does its own thing. No one touches it. And they went up and they found it had been painted over, but probably about 3 times. And of course, as we know, on a ship, if it doesn't move, it gets painted. If it does move, it gets oiled, greased.
Yeah. Well,
and it got me thinking. Actually, I thought, do you know what? If that had been the satellite system, the communication system, if this was a Starlink antenna, it would be maintained perfectly.
Of
because
course,
they were motivated to do it. They have a link to it.
Yeah.
the fact is, no one knew what this box was about. No one had any connection to what it was doing. And so no one even went to check. And when the guys went up to paint the Monkey Island, they just painted over it.
But it doesn't move. Put a put a little primer on it. So I've probably been guilty of that as well. Talk a little bit about some of you guys have gone in and you talked about when you approach people. A little bit about the successes, because I have seen some things that you are starting to measure and attribute some of your successes into, monetary things here. And I always try to be a little careful about too much of making a thing infomercial, which we were not doing. But I really am curious to see like how you are measuring and how it is interpreting into a monetary type thing, because I think that gets into motivation. And then the other part of that is, what motivation are you giving the crew? Because the monetary thing goes really for the ship owner, and then again to the charterer, whether it's in terms of a negotiated carbon credits or a charter rate or whatever. But talk a little bit about those two aspects, because I think it's an interesting point.
I'm going to start with the second one there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious about that. I always
start with the crew. So, I mean, what we actually do is we have an app and we send emails directly to the crew. And we use behavioral change techniques. So there's loads of different behavioral change techniques that go into these communications. The colors used, the fonts, what's said, where. I can give you just a couple of examples. The biggest example is we set smart targets. So a bit like when you're given so many steps per day that you need to do, a circle that you need to fill, 10,000 steps, that type of thing, but around a behavior. So let's say this auxiliary engine behavior, we create a behavior called efficient auxiliary engine usage, and it just looks at how well the demand of the vessel is being met. Do you have too many engines online? How quickly are you taking one off? Within half an hour, have you taken the engine offline? Those types of things. And they become a behavior. And then you see how many times that individual across lots of different vessels historically has behaved. And so you say to them, right, in the past, you do this 40% of the time normally. Now, there's no judgment there. There's no, this is good, this is bad. This is just what you can do. This is what the data tells us you can do. And let's say that's 6 times out of a possible 14 in a 2-week period. So the next 2 weeks, can you do it 7 times? Just a bit more. And it's a smart target. It's based exactly on what they've done, their personal targets. It's achievable because it's only slightly better or higher than they have done before. It's specific. We're being very specific about what we want them to do. And you make sure that it's possible as well. So this is a key thing. The behavior has to be possible. So you have to make sure that you eliminate or exclude the data where it's at times where it's not possible. So yes, we know that when you are on standby and maneuvering, you need to have an extra auxiliary engine running for safety purposes, of course. So we will make sure we exclude that data, those types of things. And we set them these targets. And so that's the first motivational tool is around those targets that are being set. We find that if you put generic KPIs for people, the people at the bottom there's an S curve, the difference in the variation in human behavior. And you find the people at the bottom of that curve, they look up to a generic target and just say it's not possible, it's too high. And the people who perform above it look down to it and they lose motivation as well, because they say, well, what have I been doing all this time? Why have I been outperforming that KPI? All right, well, I won't bother anymore. So these personalized targets are really key to getting that motivation. And then there's impact reframing as well. So believe it or not, saving money for your boss isn't actually a motivating factor for anyone on its own. And at the moment, that's all efficiency is for someone on the vessel, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's either saving money or giving them the ability to earn more money. It's whatever, however you want to, whatever column you're going to put that into, that's all it is.
Yeah. So why should that motivate you as a crew member on board a vessel? I'm saving money for, let's say, a charterer who has just chartered this vessel for a month. I don't know who they are. I'm never going to meet them in my life. Where's the motivation there? So let's reframe that. Let's say, right, actually, in the past 2 weeks, you did the same as planting 10,000 trees. You took 100 cars off the road with these actions that you're doing. Now suddenly you're actually doing something for the planet. You're doing something
Right.
for your children, for the world.
Right.
It's reframing that. And then we also do things like pro-social incentives. So the idea of every time you hit one of those targets, $10 is donated to a charity that you care about. As a seafarer, you're out there often longing for home, thinking about home. Now, let's think if you can know that by doing your job well, and that's all you have to do, you don't have to do anything extra, you just have to do your job. $10 is being donated to a charity that you care about. Suddenly it brings meaning to doing that job well, real meaning. And so now you're not only sort of getting better and better by at your job, your professional development, you're sort of helping to save the planet. You're doing something morally good in that way, but you're also helping a charity. And these motivational factors just keep coming and building on each other.
That's really interesting because, again, going back to when I was sailing, I don't even think that I thought about who the charterer was and everything else. Again, I worked on Jones Act ships and we went from A to B. It was for an oil. I mean, there was not a lot. I don't think there was a lot to really think about who we worked for because we worked for Mobil Oil. So that was a very different thing, but I don't think it ever really got to that point. One of the questions that I do love, and you're kind of talking about this in a general way, and we really haven't talked actually about this, but I do know one of the looming problems that our industry has is I've heard a number up to 90,000 seafarers. We're going to be light 90,000 seafarers in the coming years. And this is not just international, but this is also a U.S. and I'm not aware. I just haven't read about it, but I'm sure in other areas like the UK and others that have a maritime heritage, but it has a fleet for certain things, but you're seeing that get smaller. If you had to say something to somebody, whether to be a seagoing career or a career ashore, why should they come in and be part of our industry?
Because it's exciting. There's never a dull day in this industry. There is a frustrating day. Yes, there's a challenging day. But with those huge challenges and huge frustrations come huge rewards. Fine, if you want to have a life that is steady, don't get into the maritime industry. But actually, it's hugely rewarding in the same way that is hugely challenging. They come hand in hand. And I think it's a fabulous place to be. If that's the type of person that you are, absolutely. And also, I think that you have to realize that there's so much happening in the industry now that just because you go on board ship as a deck officer doesn't mean that you are going to stay on board ship for the rest of your life and retire a captain. You can go to sea as a deck officer, have fabulous experiences around the world on a vessel, and then you can move into all sorts of other areas. You can go into software development. You can go into operations. You can go into brokerage. There's so many options because it's such a worldwide, it's international, and it's an industry with so many different areas and niches that you will never get bored in the maritime industry. That's for sure.
And I think that it's opening up, becoming more interesting to people without that seagoing experience, somebody who didn't go to one of the maritime universities, because of things that you're doing in other companies where you're using data and you're using technology, whether it's for efficiency or other things. But you don't have to be a maritime person. You could have a passion and then just be around enough maritime people to get it. I use the example all the time. The developers I work for, they're obviously not shipping people. They're developers, but they start to ask questions, and then those questions are, wow, okay. I said, well, that's why we're putting this feature in there. We started to look at something years ago for STS, and they're like, well, what's STS? I'm like, oh, ship to ship. They're like, and I literally shared a Google video of a ship doing an STS, and they're like, oh, that really, like, that happens? And to me, it's like, well, yeah, how do you think these big, they just never thought about like how that gets from A to B. And I think that that's what is really neat about this industry. As we wrap up, I love to ask the following question. I know you're busy traveling. You just spoke at a conference. but we do have the holiday season. We're coming into full effect here. By the time I drop this, we'll be at high holiday season. What are you reading? What's on your bedside, or what do you throw into your travel bag when you're off to a conference or what have you?
I'll be honest with you. Right now, I'm rereading Nudge, the book where I guess all this kind of started. Just because at that last conference, I gave away copies of the book.
Oh wow! Okay.
And I thought, actually, I've given these copies out, and it's been a good few years since I read it. I probably need to read up on what I'm giving people. But it was the book that got the Nobel Prize for science, based on the idea that we need to be able to quantify human behavior in a scientific way. That lots of people have, for a long time, were doing it very wrong. They were taking, correlation, finding, causation from it, and then drawing the wrong conclusions. And that actually scientific method had to be brought to human behavior and working out why humans do what. And that's what they did. And that was back in 2007, I think, or 2008 that book first came out. And it's really quite a pivotal text at the birth of behavioral science. And as I say, after having handed it out, I did think, oh goodness, how much?
That's it. I have that. Yeah, I have that experience. I reread it once in a while. Never Split the Difference, the book about negotiation by Chris Voss. And I recommend that. Like, I tell people, I say, you gotta read that. And it's really interesting. But every now and again, I got to go back and reread it because I'm like, oh, okay, am I making the right point that I want to make with it? It's a good book. But Nudge, that sounds like maybe a good one. A couple of books in that area. I'm looking at my bookshelf. Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Slow, Thinking Fast, or whatever.
Oh yeah.
Harriet, I tried like twice to read that book. I don't know if it's his writing style or the topic. Maybe when I read it, I tried to read it a couple of years ago, multiple times. To me, that was a tough one to start. I usually don't have a problem with that. I could usually get over that hump, but Nudge, we'll put it on the list. Harriet, thank you for coming on the podcast. This was really interesting because we talk about the seafarers. And we talk about the importance of the seafarers. But I think this is the first time that we got into kind of the nitty gritty on motivating the seafarers. We know that they are the integral part of, the implementation of any sort of efficiency that the industry is going to have. And it makes it extra hard because it's away from the home office. It's not like the factory I mentioned, Pratt & Whitney. Well, the factory sits right there and the headquarters is right there. So, you can see what's going on, but there's a lot of interesting things. And thanks for engaging in this conversation, because it was really interesting in a way that I think is going to have a lasting impact.
You're welcome. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you about it.
Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of The Last Dinosaur, Maritime Shipping in the Digital Age. And I'm your host, Chris Aversano. As a reminder, if you enjoy this episode, please follow the podcast and leave a 5-star review. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and improve our content. Don't forget to share the podcast with friends and colleagues who are passionate about the maritime industry. Every share helps us grow our community. If you'd like to support the podcast, consider buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/thelastdinosaur. Your support helps cover the cost of production and keeps the show going strong. Lastly, if you're interested in sponsoring an episode or becoming a partner, please reach out to me directly. Drop me an email at thelastdinosaurpod@gmail.com. I'm always looking for partners who share my vision for the future of maritime shipping in the digital age. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time on The Last Dinosaur.